I appreciate the opportunity.
Yes, you were here recently and we were talking about everything involved with your writing, and you briefly said something about all the entrepreneurial endeavors you do. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that because we've got a lot of people that listen and that juggle several things. And so I just wanted your take on what other things you're doing in life and how you make it fit with your writing schedule.
Yeah, so I've always been a self-starter, and I think that as an entrepreneur and someone who enjoys work, for me, owning several businesses or being involved in multiple endeavors at the same time come naturally. I don't mind the juggle, and for me, I'm not the kind of person that sits around. The 9 to 5 thing is never attracted for me, and even if it was something as an athlete when I was younger or as a writer, things happen at 5 a.m., they happen at 10 p.m. And you just have to, even when I was playing hockey, some of our rink time was at midnight, and so you get used to having varying schedules. And for me, I don't mind it. And if it's in your blood, it's hard to get away from it. So, I enjoy it. And there's something to be said about the challenge of being cast into a very deep ocean and having to tread water and or swim for long periods of time, and just know that you have the faith that you can do it. And so I don't mind it, and for me, I think if entrepreneurship is in your blood, you'll find a way to get there.
Okay, that that is very good information, especially when you're talking about being on the ice rink at midnight and you have to adjust your schedule on the fly. And um, what was it like for you when you did? Were you ever one of those people though that had your schedule in place and then someone else's schedule? If you wanted to do it, you were going to have to somehow change on the fly.
Yeah, all the time, right? So, for me, my first job out of college, I worked for a U.S. senator who was on the Armed Services Committee in D.C. And you want to talk about juggling schedules? I mean, it would change every 5 minutes, and part of it was, a matter of priority. Something would be pulled, and you'd have to get pulled into, a committee meeting or a hearing, or, the another member of the Senate would call or the president would call, and it didn't matter what you were doing. And you always had to be ready in the sense that if the boss was no longer available, you'd have to step in and be his representative at that time. And so I learned a lot about that. And I learned how he kind of juggled those things too. And early morning flights, I'm over at his house at 4 a.m., picking him up to get him to the airport at 5. And he's working on the way there, right? And you pick him up that night at 7 or 8, and he's working on the way home. But he had a kind of a standing rule that he would try to be home by no later than 7 every night to be with his family, because he had 7 kids, and they were all young at the time. And so even though his wife was a professional and formerly had been a nurse, just by the weight of it all, it had pulled him into a situation where he had to defer to her schedule. So she was there helping him, but he wanted to be there for his kids. And so I learned by watching. It was almost like Karate Kid, where you have the wax on, wax off
Right.
moment, where you don't even know you're doing it,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden, Mr. Miyagi says, "Do it, wax on, wax off, paint the fence, sand the floor," and you're doing all these things, and you were like, "Wow," and that helped me understand what it would be like if I were to have my own business, or to someday run for office, or all of those things combined. And I decided that business was the way for me to go, and I started my first company, and it was the same way. It's like you have the discipline of getting up in the morning, and you have to follow through your schedule. And sometimes your schedule must bend to your clients, to, in his case,
Mhm.
his constituency or someone around him. And then you have to build the right team around you to be able to handle and manage that. And for me, the idea of punching a clock just never appealed. And there's nothing wrong with that. My father punched a clock.
Yeah.
My mother punched a clock. But the for me, I knew that would drive me insane.
Mhm.
So I had to do something that I would affect every day, and be sort of driving the ship. But I had my apprentice moments, right, where you have to
Right.
learn from those that are in front of you, and watching what he did, and coupled with the kind of stuff that I knew I was going to need to do. You learn it on the fly, and you also learn those best and worst practices.
What was your first business?
So I had a defense lobbying company. It was focused primarily on technology companies that needed to access the government marketplace. And for me, my job was to get them into the right places, whether they were looking for money for research and development or testing and evaluation of their new technologies, or they needed to access the right legislators that were on the right committees, or the right officers within the Pentagon or the White House. My job was to put them in touch with those folks and then let their technology speak for itself. If it was something that was superior than what the Department of Defense had, or energy, or transportation, or health and human services, the idea was, my job was to open the doors for them, get them in, and let them make their pitches. And in some cases, it was through those relationships they were able to secure work or contracts or grants or access to the right people they needed. In other cases, they would learn that they weren't ready for that process and they needed to hit certain benchmarks and then come back. And so my services were exactly that. And then beyond that, um, when COVID happened, um,
Mhm.
DC shut down for about a year and a half, right? There wasn't a lot to do and everything became remote. And that's when I became a writer.
Yep.
And then, during that time, I realized that I can be doing other things. So, I started a communications company, which, houses my writing. It also houses, I do NFL and NHL, it's like scouting for an online magazine for their prospects. I also own Altered Reality Magazine, which is a magazine for speculative fiction and poetry. And all of those endeavors fall within sort of the confines of this greater communications company that I own called Excalibur Communications.
Goodness gracious. So the early business is no more once COVID
Right.
okay.
Yeah.
So it sounds like the stuff that you've turned into businesses or went and made a business for were things that you definitely had a connection with and you knew you didn't want to do the 9 to 5. What would you say to people that aren't sure what that is they want to do, but they know for certain it's not punch the clock and they're trying to
Yeah. Well, they
figure
have to find something that they're passionate about, right? So I look at this in two forms, and I give the same two pieces of advice to anybody who wants to be an entrepreneur.
Mhm.
First is, don't do something that you can't see yourself doing 16 hours a day. And when I say that, it's more than that. There are times when you'll be working on a holiday. There'll be times when you're working on the weekend. Like I have 3 NFL draft day events coming up on April 25th of this year, 10 days from now. And all at the same time in 3 different cities. Guess what I did this weekend? I worked. What am I doing tonight? I'm working. What am I doing right now? I'm working. But I'm working now. This is on my authorship business
Yeah.
where we're now talking about my entrepreneurial
What we're
endeavors,
talking
right? So like, yeah, so you get all those things and you just have to balance it and make sure you have enough time to get you done. But I wouldn't do it if I didn't love it. And if you're making a widget and you don't like making that widget, then that's not the business for you. Secondly, and even though this might sound counterintuitive to those that are risk averse, Cortez, when he came to the New World, burned his boats so that his men would not think about going back to Spain. Right? There was no choice; they had to make it in the New
Mhm.
World. And the same thing holds true for an entrepreneur. The minute you have a foot back in what you used to do, you're going to fall back to that because that's an insurance policy, and you're giving yourself an out, and that doesn't work. The minute that you can retreat into something that is a bad habit or an old habit or something that gives you that out, then that means you're not committed to it. You have to commit to this thing in a way that it's your life, especially as a new company. Any kind of startup or small business, you're going to be running at 24/7, 365, and the buck stops with you. You can't be looking back to that old job that you had saying, well, I can go do that on the weekends. That doesn't work. Your business will
Mhm.
not succeed. You have to be 100% in, 100% in. And so I tell people, find something you love to do and then burn the boats.
Burn the
And then
boat.
you won't have any choice except to make that succeed.
Kind of there is no plan B. You're going with
Yeah.
plan A. Yeah.
Yeah. There is no plan B.
Well, which brings me to something that I feel like I like the word hustle, but I think we've turned this hustle culture into something that not everybody can manage. What do you say about boundaries and making sure you're getting the rest you need to recover or see your family and all of those things that we need to think about when we're going into business?
Well, sure. And look, I'm not saying that you're ignoring your kids or your wife or husband or whatever it might be. but ultimately, there's teamwork there, right? Your partner needs to be able to tell you that, hey, I know what you're doing, and I get that you're making this decision that's going to benefit us in the long run, and for the short-term sacrifice, this will put us over the top, and then we'll be on an easier street than we would be if you would continue down the path you were on, right? And then second, so they're partners in this too with you.
Mhm.
When I started writing, my wife did DoorDash, you know what I mean,
Yeah.
to make extra money. And when the government was shut down, I had no business. Like literally, people were like, "Well, there's no way for us to chase money because there is no money to chase." And so therefore, I had to find a different outlet. And starting a writing career is difficult because you don't make money until book 3 or 4, right?
Mhm.
And so it's a bit just like owning a business. You're investing in your time in that. And in this case, I wanted to make sure that my wife was okay making more money on the side so that I could, do this. And that's how that got off the ground. And the other things got off the ground as a result of that. And even though we're still working through that stuff, she doesn't have to work DoorDash anymore. Now she could if we needed her to, or for all intents and purposes, I could too,
Mhm.
to pick up some extra cash to make sure we're paying the bills. So that's part one. But you're right. I mean, you like I go to the gym once a day, right? I make sure that I'm there because of health issues. I also, at night, I turn everything off at 11, but I'm up early and I don't need as much sleep as most people, and I've never needed as much sleep as most people. And I'll catch up on it on the weekends, and on holidays and stuff like that if I need to. We always try to make sure that we take vacations, and then folks that have children, obviously there's things you're going to be doing at night on the weekends with them as well. And so you have to consider those things, and oftentimes maybe opening a business at that time isn't the right time for you to have it, or you have to make sure that you're over certain things, so that you can be part of their lives. So you're right, there has to be a work-life balance there, but understand that no matter what happens, you might get that strange call out of nowhere saying, "Hey, this isn't working," or "This is failing," or "I failed to do something," and that impacts your business. You might have to step away, to take that call. So you have to have the right structure, right family structure at home, and make sure that everybody's recognizing that, and also make sure you take care of yourself too. Because without that, and look, I'm not a pillar of health by any means, but by the same token, I make sure that I hit the gym every day, and that means getting up an extra 45 minutes early.
Yeah.
Then that's what it takes.
Yeah. So what about when you have, like, for example, 3 different things that need your attention? What's your structure like? How do you like to kind of choreograph the moving parts?
Yeah, well, it's a triage, right? It's
Yeah.
like you walk into the business that morning and you find out A, B, and C all need to be done today. Well, what's going to take the longest time? What's going to be the most difficult to tackle? What
Mhm.
could I delegate to one of my staffers? What do I need to handle on my own? If there's a need for us to push something back, what would that be? How do I communicate that to my clients to make sure they understand there might be a short delay? In other cases, you just have to tackle it, and and make sure that you get it done. And if it takes your attention, that's why you're the boss. You get all the accolades, and you get all the success, but you also get all the bad things that come with it. And if you're okay with ownership of all those things, and don't mind that controlling your own destiny, then that's the right thing for you. And for me, I don't mind the juggle, and if you're look, if you plan well enough,
Mhm.
you rarely do have to juggle. There's always going to be emergency, or there's always
Mhm.
going to be an issue that pops up every now and then. But if 85, 90% of your time you're on schedule because you plan to be on schedule, then you're better off, and you can handle those things because they're not all that frequent.
What are some things that you've done to make yourself a better entrepreneur and business owner? Like, what kind of books have you read? What kind of courses, if any, have you taken? What kind of studies do you do to better yourself?
Yeah, so mine or my bachelor's was in political science and European studies. So when it was time for me to become a CEO, that's what grad school was for, and that's what an MBA was for. Now, I would also suggest to many that academic learning of business running is far afield from what actually happens. And there was uh, Rodney Dangerfield made a movie back in the 80s, where he basically went back to school, and that was the name of the movie. But he was a successful entrepreneur, and he was in this classroom, and and when he was asked a question about what he would do in an academic setting, he basically answered it in a funny way, saying that would never happen, and this is why this happened, and told the story. And the kids stopped looking at the professor and turned to him and started taking notes. Well, all those things are true. Yeah, you can learn to balance a book, and and I'll give you a perfect example of this. Is one of my old business partners, his wife was a double, uh, master's degree from UVA, and he and I were running our first business together. And she said at the time, you're not supposed to take a salary unless you have 2 months receivables in the bank. Well, we ran that company very successfully and exited it 10 years later, and we never had 2 months receivables in the bank. And it's the academic practice of it, where, yeah, if you
Mhm.
could get that, that would be great. And then the real life practice of it is it doesn't work that way ever. Right.
Yeah.
And so you have to balance those things. So really what I would say is the majority of the learning is on the job. It's
Yeah.
figuring out what works and what doesn't work, what you look for in employees, what you look for in training of those employees, what you can do for yourself, the technologies you can bring in. And one of the biggest lessons I've learned is if you don't know the horse, don't make the bet. And what I mean by that is if you go to court, you take a lawyer. You don't go on your own. If
Yeah.
you're going in front of the IRS, you take an accountant. You don't go on your own. And so when there are things out there that you don't know how to do, it's better to pay for them so that they're done professionally and the right way the first time. Then that'll save you heartache and money and time, which all equates to more money and heartache and time if you do it the wrong way. And even though it might be difficult and you may not want to cut those checks, at the end of the day, it's the best thing for you and you can learn it. And
Mhm.
maybe that's something that you can, insource into your firm, or you can handle eventually once you do learn it. In other cases, you always want to outsource it. It's something that it's going to take me 18 hours to do, but if I send this to my accountant, he's going to have it done in 35 minutes.
Mhm.
Boom, gone to the accountant, and that saves me 18 hours in my day
Wow.
that I can then do chasing profitability as opposed to trying to figure out how do I do my own taxes. And those kind of things I recommend. Now, I realize that, especially for startups, that's hard to do. And I would work with certain vendors that are used to working with small or startup businesses, that will give you leeway and they'll give you a net 30 or a net 60 to pay them. And that way you've got ways to getting money in the door. Because in the beginning, it's not it's not easy, right?
Mm-mm.
It's the worst. Everything you hear is true about those first 2 years of being an entrepreneur, where 90% of businesses fail in year one and 90% of businesses fail in year two, which means of that you got to cut that down, select a 5%. That's got to be you. How do you make sure you get there when no one will give you a loan and you
Yeah.
can't get a credit card and there's no one's going to defer? You've got to be ready for those kind of things. And so I would, suggest working with folks that'll give you a little bit of leeway, or in some cases will understand that they're betting on the come. And like, hey, if I work with you now and you're successful, that I know I'll have a much larger contract down the road with
Mhm.
you because you're going to stay with me based on the loyalty I showed you in the beginning. And I think all of those kind of things are pieces of advice that I would give to other fellow entrepreneurs.
You seem like you're pretty laid back. What makes you sweat? What makes you get nervous that things aren't going to be executed the way you want?
It's weird that it's a great question because I just don't have that bone in my body. And I think a lot of other entrepreneurs are the same way, where you just know you're going to succeed.
Huh.
And you might not, right? Like there's
Yeah.
lots of times where I get into something. I'm going through a couple of those things right now where it was like, hey, I knew this path was going to be the right way, and it turns out it isn't. But then you
Mhm.
find a diversion and you find a way around, or work around for that, and you just have to stay creative. But you have to have faith in yourself and the ability you've got to make something work and get it done. And it may not go as smoothly or by the book. And that's why I think the academic practice is great in terms of practice and
Mhm.
planning,
Mhm.
but it never goes that way, ever, 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 ever once in my life did it ever go that way. Never goes by the, and you just have to be agile. And that's the great thing about being a small business is you
Yeah.
can be agile. You can make decisions as the owner. You don't have to run it through a board, or the next board meeting's in 3 months, or
Right.
I've got to go through a committee or an executive committee to make a decision, or this has got to float through three different people. It's your business. You make that
Mhm.
decision right now. And
Mhm.
I think that agility allows you to do some things and course correct when you see things going off the rails. But I also think it takes a certain kind of personality to be an entrepreneur. Not everybody
Mhm.
does it, but I think this
Mhm.
country's filled with them. I mean, think about what it takes for people to give up everything they've had and get on a ship and come to the, at the time,
Mhm.
a new world to be a farmer or to start a business or
Yeah.
whatever. It's the impossibility of that. And people did it. And this country's filled with people that believed that it was okay to get on that boat, you know what I mean, and come here or cross that border and come here because they wanted a better life for their family and they weren't getting it where they were, whether it was a government thing or a social structure thing or a religious thing. They were running away from that to come here because this was different, right? And this was a place. And so I think that maybe we have more type A's in this country that because they're the ones that took the risk to come here, right? And but again, it's just not. I think that I don't know, like it's that bone in your body that says, "I'm going to get it done. It'll work. I have no choice. I will make this work." And then you don't. I don't get anxious. That doesn't mean that I don't look over my shoulder, and that doesn't mean
Right.
that I don't plan, and that doesn't
Yes.
mean that I don't go back and course correct. All of those things happen, but if I was afraid of one thing stopping me, then I would have never started this because that's the biggest thing. It's like I have this funny story about my mother when I was growing up. She was like, "Well, I don't understand. Why don't you just get into computer science and you'll always have a job?"
Yeah.
And I was like, "I don't know. That's not me."
Yeah.
Right. So it's
Yeah.
like, that's not what I'm going to do. But she was used to that. Like my father was a steel worker and she was a nurse and it was a 9 to 5 thing. And they went and did their job and came home. And so for her, stepping out of that risk profile and that risk aversion was
Mhm.
difficult to impossible.
Yeah.
For me, staying in that 9 to 5 thing would have been very impossible for me. I just don't
Yeah.
work that way. So, of course I'm going to find my way in it. And you just have that inner faith that you're going to get it done.
Okay, so you touched on needing to have the faith and the you have to have some confidence. So what about the people that don't have that and they're trying to build that confidence in themselves to make it happen when it's just like they're a little bit like, hmm, not sure I can do this.
Well, if you don't know that you can, then I wouldn't recommend you try it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's a lot of downside if you're that's what I mean about commitment, about burning the boats.
Mm-hmm.
You just have to know, like, I know this is going to work. And even if it doesn't work, it's okay. You could find something else from that'll translate, right? I was at a conference once. This goes back maybe 10 years ago, and there was a guy from Google there and I was work at the time. I was doing some work with a robotics organization. It was with a university, and he was there recruiting. And I said to him, "What are you looking for out of the students that are here?" And he said, "Not a lot." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And he said, "We would rather hire a kid that started his own app and business and failed and doesn't has never gone to college, but did that anyway and
Mm-hmm.
saw what it was like and is now, getting the next thing done versus someone who went to a traditional college who got a, English literature degree, spent 4 years. He's
Mm-hmm.
like, I'd rather have that entrepreneurial person, and that's who they targeted, right? And it was different to hear that about how there's been a decline in the value of that 4 year degree. It's almost like at one point that was the second step in the American dream. It was first coming to the country, then it was home ownership, and now it was sending your kids to college. And now it's like, well, we're looking for a different type of person. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? We're not looking, we'll still hire you and we'll train you the way we want you to work with
Yeah.
us but we're looking for a certain type of person, and that person needs to be someone that's an entrepreneur. And that's the thing. It's like you're either it or you're not in most cases. And some folks can be coaxed into it, but if you need coaxing, you're probably not going to succeed the way that you need to. You
Mm-hmm.
have to be all in. And I say that, having failed in some businesses and also wildly succeeded in others,
Mm-hmm.
um, it's just I think it's something that's in your DNA or it isn't. And if you're really trying to, hey, I'm on the fence, I don't know. Is it because you don't know because you don't know how to get there? That's one thing. That can be discussed and taught and trained and learned.
Uh-huh.
If it's the other thing where it's like, I don't know, it's just not for me, then don't do
Yeah.
it, even though you could. I would just recommend against that.
Okay, let's talk about you said you've had some businesses that failed. Let's talk about the entrepreneurs that are going along and maybe their business isn't just completely failing, but when what are the signs to knowing you should get out or sell or it's just not right? What are some of those things to look for? Because sometimes they're not obvious.
Yeah, well, sometimes, I mean, I can answer that question in a variety of different ways. The first is sometimes it's market forces, right?
Hmm.
So I talked before about the business I have, which was very successful prior to COVID. And when COVID happened, there was just no work there, right? So the market forces dictated that I change direction and do something else. And so I chose to do that. And that could be upsetting, right? And I don't
Hmm.
mean that from a like emotional perspective as much as that means like a planning perspective. I mean, that was a retirement for me, or that was, my next 10 years of work that I had planned. It was good. My career was going down that path. And all of a sudden there's a jarring moment there because there's a market or a course correction there, and you have to take care of that. The second part of it is instinctively knowing if a business isn't going well. Sometimes it's easy. You can look at your checkbook, right, and say,
Hmm.
well, we're just not making that much money. But usually there's a reason why. You're
Okay.
either running it poorly, or someone else has a competitive advantage, or there's a disruptive technology that's displaced your old way of doing business and you need to catch up and do that. And you can identify those things if you're paying attention to it. And if you realize that even though you're used to making all the decisions, not every decision you make is going to be the right one, you might have to go back and take a step back, before you can take two steps forward, right? So like it's okay to course correct and try to change things and see if they'll work themselves out, even if that means the way you train people, the way you're presenting your product and or services, the way you rebrand yourself changes at the top, changes at the bottom. Sometimes what I found in one of my businesses is I was my biggest problem.
Hmm.
I won't say where this was, but I had sold my company to an entity that didn't really accept the entrepreneurial spirit that I had when I was independent.
Okay.
And they expected me to kind of just roll in and run the division of what was like my company, run it under their umbrella.
Hmm.
But the entrepreneur in me was fighting that the whole way. And it took me
Hmm.
3 years to realize that I was complaining, once a quarter to the board, and then it was once a month, and then it was once a week. And I was like, wait, and it took me 3 years to notice that the problem wasn't them. That was the way they did business. The problem was
Hmm.
me. Right.
Hmm.
And so I made a decision to leave and go back into an entrepreneurial endeavor as opposed to staying in there, even though I could have easily retired and been very comfortable doing the stuff that I could have done under there if I was okay playing by their rules. But there were
Yeah.
opportunities that I saw them leaving on the table. They just weren't set up to chase them. And
Yeah.
meanwhile, the entrepreneur in me is like, oh, you're leaving money on the table. And it just wasn't the right fit. So I made a conscious decision to leave. And that's the same kind of thing I would recommend is realize that sometimes it's not the people around you. It could be you or the system and the structure that you put around you that needs to be tweaked. And maybe they're not the right people, and maybe you hired the wrong people. And, there's that old saying out there is, slow to hire and quick to fire. If you find someone isn't working, don't let it linger. Take care of it right away. And you can offer them a chance to be, trained, or offer them a chance to work within the confines you've set up for them. In other cases, you find out it's you, or the structure you put together is wrong, or needs to be updated, or there's a technology that can come in and can replace half the stuff that you're fighting to do, and all that kind of stuff. So you have to be aware of those things, and those are kind of the pieces of advice I would offer to those that aren't sure if their business or their entrepreneurship is working. Is look and find out what the problems are, identify, and be honest with yourself about
Hmm.
what's not working. And even though you might have this delusion that it's not you, sometimes it is exactly you, and you just have to
Yeah.
make those changes.
Well, you touched on employees, how that can be really challenging knowing how many to hire and the right fit. It's fit is always something. Personalities are never going to be perfect to match up. And what kind of insight do you have for that?
Yeah, so that's what, when I would don't be lazy during the interview process, right? When
Yeah.
you're talking to employees and potential employees, take them through it. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Make sure they understand what a day in the life of is going to look like, and understand how you think that they work, and definitely take them up on the opportunity to call their references. And you'll find out, when you're calling someone and you ask questions and they answer them truthfully to you as a reference, you'll get a sense of who they are and what they do. And I would also, it's hard to hire someone you've not worked with in the past.
Yeah.
I always try to hire people that I've worked with that are in and or around my industry, either adjacent to or 1 degree of separation of, because I know how they work because I've worked with them and I enjoy working with them and I see how they respond to me and I see how they treat other people in the community and all those other kind of things too. So take that interview process seriously. Don't hire someone out of need and just, hey, oh, you're available, come on in tomorrow. I mean, there are times when I get it. You have to, there's an order and you need 40 bodies somewhere.
Mhm.
I totally get that. But in most cases, go through a process, have them meet with other people in and around your business, make sure they're the right cultural fit for what you're trying to do, as well as seeing how they've treated other people in those communities. And, do they send a thank you letter or an email these days, right? Those thank you
Right.
letters are kind of, no one does that anymore. Maybe I'm showing my age a little bit there, but, ultimately that's the thing is like, hey, what do they do? Do they follow up? Are they, and you'll be able to tell right away. I mean, everybody's on their best behavior month one, but
Right.
month two,
Yeah.
all of a sudden there's a degrade in that. And it's like, and sometimes, familiarity breeds contempt, and it's like, well, I really don't have to do that now or whatever it might be. But
Mm.
even the smallest of things, the way they
Yeah.
treat other people around them, or when they empty the coffee, do they remake another pot,
Right.
like that kind of stuff, and I'm not saying you fire someone over that, but ultimately those are like the tip
But
offs that yeah, right. Yeah. And
yep,
those
yep.
are the kind of things I look for. And so make sure that they're culturally a fit. And then also make sure that you're comfortable working with them because you're going to be married to them for a long time.
Great tips. Thanks for coming back and sharing. Come back anytime. What's on the horizon for you?
So I was mentioning earlier today, if we're going to stay on the entrepreneurial side, one of my companies that I own, Draft Nation, is an e-magazine for sports that covers all four professional sports drafts. And in about 10 days from now, the NFL draft is up. And so we are running 24/7, 365 on our guides, on our events, on our podcasts. It's a little crazy. And there's a bit of a dip. And then we go into like almost back to back to back drafts for Major League Baseball, hockey, and basketball starting at the end of June and the middle of July. And then there's a giant gap for us to catch up. So when you said, where do you get your sleep? My sleep stock starts August 1st.
August 1st. You are out. Down for the count. Well,
Yep.
thank you. Come back when you catch a breath. Love to hear more about your writing and your other endeavors and share with us. We'll cross promote. Love having you. Thanks so much.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me back anytime.
Thanks.